Well, it is Pentecost, and Pentecost is far more of an important event for the Jews than it is for us, for a number of reasons, because the Jewish people were very much into remembering. They do not want to forget. The Passover, for instance, is remembering when they were slaves and God pulled them out. And so that was the greatest event in their life, a great celebration. In fact, everyone within a certain radius had to be at the celebration in Jerusalem. Pentecost is the same thing. They have to remember. They need to remember how Moses, when they took them out from Egypt and placed them in the desert, how God gave them the laws of Moses, the 10 Commandments as we call it, and how important it was for them to help them remind themselves of who they were as God's people, so we cannot forget. And so we gather 50 days after the Passover. Also happens to be right after the spring's harvest. So a great way to remember God is to respond to God appropriately. So people brought their best harvest. Not what's left over after they've had their own personal meals, but their best. And they came to Jerusalem and they celebrated. They celebrated the laws of Moses. They celebrated the presence of God in their lives, of how God spoke to them. They celebrated each other as a family. And they brought forth all the crops and they had a big fellowship dinner. And so there they celebrated. It's important for us mainly because we remember the last Passover that Jesus went to. You remember that one? It's kind of a big deal for us. We refer to that as Easter because it really didn't end up very well for Jesus. He was killed at the hands of his own people. And as the gospel story tells, that right after his death, it was then Jesus who reappeared almost as if it were a ghost to his disciples, and he gathers them together and he says, I want you to go back into Jerusalem for the Pentecost, for that great celebration, and pull everyone together. And we're going to answer the question that you have right now in your mind, which is what? What in the world are we going to do without Jesus? So 50 days passed, and there they gathered back into Jerusalem for the Pentecost. And the people gathered together, sharing stories of the events that took place, trying to make sense out of all the things that were happening. And suddenly this great wind, this violent wind, moved among them. Swirling around, it disrupted things. I can only imagine there was a lot of fear of what was happening, a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of wonderment. But through this whole process, they began to realize that this death that their leader, Jesus, went through doesn't mean he is gone. He is among us in ways that they never experienced before. It wasn't a physical presence like it was in the past. It was kind of mystical. It was rather spiritual. That's what wind means. His presence now was more inward. It was more silent, but even more powerful than they could ever imagine. And it was through this unique presence of Jesus that they began to realize that his work on this earth is going to be done by the Spirit, but also through us. We are the ones who are now to do the very works of Jesus in the world. And this is what we talk about in baptism, that this is the great promise that Jesus made to all of his followers. That your life is no longer going to be determined by who you work for. It's no longer determined by the world in which you live. It's no longer determined or defined by the people around you. Your life now is determined and defined by God. It is God who claims you. And this is what the Apostle Paul meant when he said these words. You know, it is no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, Pentecost isn't the first time that the disciples heard this message before. Jesus had talked to them about this before. They just didn't understand it. They didn't get it. They didn't experience it in unique ways. So in John's gospel, just after Jesus dies, he reappears to his disciples. And his disciples, where will they find them? Well, they're doing what we always do when we grieve. We go back to the workplace, right? We work. We love to work. Work makes us quit thinking. And so they go back to work as usual. There's Peter and there's 6 others. They're lost, they're confused, they're full of pain, they're full of grief, and they're going back to their fishing business. And I imagine it's silent because they don't know what to say. They're trying to work through all the things that took place. And then this stranger comes among this and starts to interact with them. And it's through the interaction that they begin to realize, because there's things that he's did before that he's never saw before, that they've never seen before, or they've seen before. And all of a sudden they begin to realize this stranger is Jesus. He's come back to us. And as the story progresses, it's very obvious that this Jesus who had just died just days before was seeking out Peter. Why Peter? You mean the guy who denied him 3 times, the one who bragged in front of all of his friends? Nope, you're not going to die on my watch. I'm going to be right there. I've got your back, Jesus, but failed. You mean the Peter that ran for his life selfishly because all he could think about was himself? And now here is this Jesus coming back from the dead, and he corners him up against the beach so he can't get away. So what's Jesus going to say to him? What would you say for people who did something similar to you? I'm going to reread the words you just heard. When Jesus had finished breakfast, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Well, feed my lambs." The second time he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Tend to my sheep." And he said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt. I feel sorry for Peter, don't you? Just get finished throwing this guy to the wolves, and now he feels hurt because Jesus doesn't believe him. Or he's having to ask him 3 times for each time he denied him. So a third time, Jesus says, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt. You go wherever you wish. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." And he said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After he had said this to him, he said, "Follow me." Is there any wisdom of allowing a fox to guard the hen house? Is there any wisdom in allowing the inmates to run the asylum? Where is your wisdom if you're cooking big steaks in the backyard and you ask your dog to watch them while you go inside and get you a beverage? Where is God's wisdom in allowing the very ones who killed God's son to build God's kingdom? What's God thinking? Where's God going with this? Because surely by now God knows our abilities to be selfish, right? God knows that we are so easily distracted. Heck, we even invented a phrase that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. It's just a confession that says, hey, we always want what we know we shouldn't be getting and what we know we can't have. Even Paul, the Apostle Paul says, I don't even understand my own actions. I do not do what I want, but I do the very things that I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but I do the evil I do not want to do. I wouldn't allow this guy to cook fries at Chicken E. But here is God putting this guy in charge of building God's kingdom one church at a time. What is God thinking? What is God doing here? We are a people of irony. We will devour each other. We will kill our enemies in order to protect the Prince of Peace. Does that make sense? So why does God put the foxes in charge of the hen house? You know what my answer is to that? I don't know. I don't have a clue. I don't know what God's thinking. And being a minister is one of the most frustrating things in the world, to try to give people to live like God's kingdom really matters. But you know what's even more frustrating? Is trying to get me to live the same way. Every day I look in the mirror, and you know what I see? I see flaws of character. I see lack of ability. I see actions that are full of blunders. I see a tongue that is salty. And I say to my God, why? What are you thinking putting me in this place to represent you? And not only are you relieved to know that other people think the same thoughts about my abilities, but millions of others also doubt themselves as well. So why? Why is God putting the inmates in charge of the asylum? I don't know. I don't know. But then I just turn to Psalms. And I read, and my mind just drifts over to King David. You know King David, he's the king who is always praised as the one. And I think about him. A king who had his addictions, who obviously had his well-documented faults. He had his share of selfish moments that destroyed people's lives. He had his enemies both inside the church and outside the church. Yet, still, he is noted as one of the greatest men who ever lived. Why? Why? Because he had his good moments too. He had his ability to put aside his selfish tendency and to use the gifts that God gave him to better his people. Think of this psalm when he wrote this. When I look at your heavens, when I look at the work of your fingers, the moon, stars that you have established, what are we that you're mindful of us? We're mortals. Why care for us? Yet you made us a little lower than God. And you crowned us with glory and honor. You've given us dominion over the works of your hands. You put things under our feet. All the sheep and the ox, all the beasts of the fields, the birds of the air, the fish in the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You see, I don't think David knows why God chose us in all of our selfish behavior to do the very works of God in this world. And maybe it's just God's plan to have God's children to stop and to see the very things that David was able to see and just realize that we are in the very presence of greatness. And that is worthy of our best praise. That is worthy of the first moment of our day. That is worthy of our first day of the week. That is worthy of the first tenth of our harvest. The first thought of our mind. The best moment of our lives. To put aside ourselves and to say, thank you, God. Thank you. But more importantly, to live like you mean it.